In a distant galaxy, on a planet far from Earth, an alien race lived under strict rules and harsh authority. Their society was governed by an unforgiving caste system, where punishment for any crime was swift and severe. It was here that the young alien girl, once a respected member of her people, found herself sentenced to a life of slavery. Her name had once been known throughout her planet as a trusted leader, a powerful and intelligent figure. She had helped guide her people for many years, but that all changed when a rival faction, looking to destroy her reputation, framed her for a crime she did not commit. The accusation was serious. She was said to have betrayed her own people and sold secrets to their enemies. It was a lie, but in their society, lies like this could ruin anyone's life. Without a trial or the chance to defend herself, she was stripped of all her status. Her position was taken away, and as punishment, she was handed over to a human, a strange, foreign race that her people looked down upon. The punishment was meant to be humiliating. The alien girl, once a proud leader, was now a slave to a human man. Her new owner, however, was not someone she had expected. He was a soldier, a man from Earth, living on the barren planet as part of a long-term survival mission. His mission was not just to survive the harsh conditions, but to learn how to adapt and overcome, a skill he had honed over many years. But when the authorities came to him with the order to take the alien girl into his custody, he was not given a choice. He was simply told that he would be responsible for her. The human man stood tall as the alien girl was brought before him. She was shackled, her wrists bound tightly with chains. Her bright blue skin shimmered under the sun, and her eyes, full of anger and fear, stared at him as if he were the one who had betrayed her. Her people had treated her like a prisoner, and now she had to endure the same fate, shackled to a human she didn't know, on a foreign planet she had never seen. "You will stay here until you learn what it means to serve," the authorities had said. With those words, they turned and left, leaving the girl in the human man's care. At first, she resisted with all her might. She hated him. He was just another part of her punishment. To her, he was nothing more than a symbol of her disgrace. Her pride kept her distant and cold. She didn't care about his kindness or his words. She wanted to escape, to fight, to break free from this cruel fate. But the shackles around her wrists were too tight. Her strength was nothing compared to the power of her captors, and her will, though strong, was quickly crushed by the weight of her chains. The human man didn't immediately know how to handle her. He had never dealt with an alien like her before. He had trained for years in the harshest conditions, but this was different. This wasn't survival against the elements or wild creatures. This was a person who was broken, forced into a life she hadn't chosen. He didn't want to add to her suffering. He looked at her not as a prisoner, but as a person who had been unfairly thrown into a terrible situation. For the first few days, the alien girl refused to speak. She ignored him completely, turning away whenever he tried to talk. He offered food, but she turned it down, her pride too strong to accept help from the one who had become her captor. Yet he didn't press her. He didn't push her to talk or make her do anything she wasn't willing to do. Slowly, he tried to earn her trust in small ways. He cleaned her wounds, offered her water, and gave her the space she needed to process everything. The human man was not cruel. He had been through his own struggles in life, living through wars and battles that had taken much from him. But he had never been a slave, never been treated like an animal. He could not imagine what it must be like for her. She watched him carefully, keeping her distance, but there was something in his eyes that made her pause. He wasn't looking at her with hatred or judgment, as many of her own people had. Instead, he looked at her with a kind of curiosity, as if he were trying to understand her. It frustrated her. She didn't want to be understood. She wanted to be left alone, to be freed from the chains that bound her, both physically and emotionally. Days turned into weeks, and though she never showed it, she began to notice the human man's actions. He would go out into the desert, gathering supplies and building a small shelter for both of them to live in. He worked hard, never complaining, always looking out for her well-being in ways she couldn't ignore. Still, she hated being here. But for the first time since she had been brought to this place, she felt a strange, confused sense of something she had never felt before: safety. As the sun began to set one evening, casting a golden glow across the barren land, the alien girl found herself sitting on the ground, staring at the horizon. The human man, sitting nearby, noticed her quiet change. He didn't say anything, just continued his work as she sat there, lost in thought. He didn't need to. He knew that in time she would open up. But for now, he would wait. The alien girl didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of something she had never expected, something that would change both of their lives forever. The days on the barren desert planet seemed to stretch on forever, each one blending into the next. The human man had created a small, functional shelter, and despite the harsh conditions, he had managed to make life somewhat bearable. It wasn't comfortable, but it was survival. His goal was simple: to continue the mission and keep the alien girl alive. But as time went on, the girl's presence began to change the dynamics of his everyday life in ways he hadn't expected. Though the alien girl continued to resist, her anger and resentment slowly started to fade. It wasn't because she had forgiven him. Far from it. But because, deep down, she couldn't ignore the small acts of kindness he showed. Every day, he would make sure she had enough food and water, and when her chains caused her pain, he would gently check them, adjusting them so they wouldn't cut into her skin. These small gestures, though insignificant to him, began to chip away at her walls, brick by brick. One evening, as the human man sat by the fire, tending to it while the girl sat a little farther away, he noticed something unusual. She wasn't angry, as usual. Instead, she stared at the flickering flames, lost in thought. Her blue skin glowed faintly in the dim light, and her eyes seemed softer, almost tired. He could see the weight of everything she had been through written on her face. "Are you hungry?" the man asked gently, his voice carrying across the small distance between them. The alien girl didn't respond right away. She didn't look at him either, but after a long silence, she slowly nodded. Her pride still kept her from speaking, but the simple act of acknowledging her need was a small, quiet victory for him. He rose from his seat and went to the supplies he had stored. There wasn't much, just dried fruits, some meat that he had hunted, and a few basic items to help them survive. The girl's eyes followed him, but she didn't move. When he returned with a small plate of food, he didn't say anything else. He simply set it in front of her and stepped back. He respected her space, giving her the freedom to decide what to do next. At first, she hesitated, but then, without a word, she reached for the food. The man watched her closely, trying not to let her see the hopeful look on his face. She ate quietly, still not looking at him, but the hunger in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. It wasn't just food she craved. It was something deeper, a connection, perhaps, or even just a simple act of kindness. As the days passed, the silence between them grew more comfortable. The human man noticed subtle changes in the alien girl. She no longer refused to eat, though she didn't speak much. Her eyes, once full of anger and distrust, now seemed to hold a quiet curiosity. She started to observe him more closely, as if trying to understand who he really was. One morning, as the sun began to rise over the horizon, the human man set out to gather more supplies. He needed to explore beyond the area they had been living in for the past few weeks. The alien girl, as usual, stayed behind, keeping to herself. But this time, something was different. As he was about to leave, she stood up and silently walked over to him. "Stay close," he warned, his voice cautious. He wasn't sure why she was following him, but something told him she wasn't just going to sit idle today. The girl didn't speak, but there was something in her body language, something he couldn't quite read, that told him she wasn't going to let him leave alone. It was a strange feeling, but he accepted it without question. They walked together through the rocky terrain, side by side, in silence. For the first time, they weren't enemies. They weren't master and slave. They were simply two beings trying to survive in a harsh world. During their walk, the man noticed how the girl seemed to be studying the environment more carefully than before. She had always been quiet, but now she seemed more aware, as if her mind were working through the situation. It was clear that she was intelligent. Her movements were sharp, her eyes never missing anything. She had been trained to be a leader, and although her people had stripped her of that role, the skills were still there, waiting to be unlocked. At one point, they came across a small rock formation. The human man was about to climb it when he noticed the girl had already found a way to scale it. Her strength was undeniable. She moved with grace, despite her chains, and reached the top effortlessly. The human man stared up at her for a moment before he shook his head in disbelief. "You're good at this," he said, his voice full of admiration. The alien girl paused for a moment before replying, her voice low. "I used to be." The words were simple, but they hit him harder than he expected. The pain in her voice, the sorrow of losing everything she once was, it was clear now. She had not only been physically imprisoned, but emotionally too. She had been stripped of her identity, her role, and her sense of purpose. But here, on this lonely desert world, she had found something else, a new kind of strength, one that was beginning to form between them. As the day wore on, the human man found himself thinking less of his mission and more about the alien girl. He had started to see her not as a punishment, but as a person, someone who had endured far too much. And despite everything, despite all the anger and resentment she held toward him, he couldn't help but wonder if, in time, she would come to see him differently too. For now, though, they were both prisoners, she of her past, and he of his mission. Yet something was changing, something neither of them could ignore. The beginning of a bond, one neither of them had anticipated, was quietly taking root in the desert sands. The days on the desert planet grew longer, and the bond between the human man and the alien girl deepened in ways neither of them had expected. What started as a forced connection, a situation of survival, was slowly becoming something more, something neither could fully understand, but both could feel. They had no choice but to rely on one another, and in doing so, they found a strange comfort in each other's company. The human man spent his time hunting and gathering, doing what he could to keep them both alive. He was beginning to notice the alien girl's quiet strength, the way she observed everything around her with sharp, intelligent eyes. She never complained, never asked for more than she needed, but he could see the sorrow in her eyes. It was a sadness that seemed to weigh heavily on her, a deep sorrow that went beyond just being a slave. It was the pain of losing everything she had once known. One morning, as the sun rose high over the horizon, the man found himself sitting outside their shelter, gazing at the barren landscape. The girl had gone silent once again, sitting a little further away, her chains clinking with every movement. Her head was lowered, her expression distant. "You're different now," the human man said, breaking the silence. "Before, you were so angry." The alien girl didn't respond right away, but the man could see the slight change in her posture. She had heard him, and though she wasn't ready to speak, her eyes betrayed her. She was listening. "I used to think that we were enemies," he continued, his voice soft. "But now, I don't know. You're not just a prisoner to me." For a moment, the alien girl said nothing. The wind howled in the distance, carrying with it the harsh, dry air that made their world so unwelcoming. But then, as if a thought had crossed her mind, she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "You freed me once." The man blinked, surprised by the words. "What do you mean?" he asked, leaning forward, curious. "I was not always like this," she said, looking at him with a strange intensity. "I was a leader, strong, respected. But they took it all away. They punished me by sending me here, to you. They wanted me to break." The human man's heart sank as he listened. He had known that she was more than just a slave, more than just the broken prisoner she appeared to be. There was a history in her, a story he hadn't yet heard. And now she was starting to share it with him. I never wanted this for you, the man replied quietly, his voice filled with regret. I never wanted to hurt you. I just wanted to survive. She looked away, but not before he saw the flash of emotion in her eyes. Anger, pain, but also something else. Something softer. It does not matter now, she said. The past is gone. They sat in silence for a long time after that. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't tense either. There was a strange peace between them, a calm that neither of them had expected to find on this desolate planet. They were still chained together, metaphorically and literally. But in that moment, it felt as though the chains weren't as heavy as they once were. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the desert, the human man stood up and stretched his arms. I'm going out for a while, he said. You can stay here if you want. The alien girl nodded, not saying a word. She didn't try to stop him, didn't ask him where he was going. It was as if, after everything, she had come to trust him, at least a little. He turned and walked away, feeling her eyes on his back. He knew he had to keep moving forward, to gather more supplies and keep them both alive. But something about that moment, the quiet trust, the understanding between them, stayed with him as he ventured further into the harsh landscape. Hours passed, and as the man returned to the shelter that evening, he was surprised to see the alien girl sitting by the fire. She had gathered some of the dried plants from the surrounding area and was trying to prepare them into something edible. She looked up as he approached, and for the first time, he saw a faint smile on her face. I made something, she said, her voice hesitant but genuine. The human man raised an eyebrow. You did. The girl nodded and gestured to the small pile of food she had prepared. It was far from a gourmet meal, but it was something. The man sat down beside her, feeling a strange warmth in his chest. This small act, her attempt to contribute, spoke volumes. It was as if she was offering him a piece of herself, a sign that she no longer saw him as just her captor, but as something more. As they ate together in silence, the man couldn't help but feel a sense of connection with her. She wasn't just an alien girl anymore. She was a person with a past, a future, and a strength that he had come to respect. That night, as they lay in the shelter, the man couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing between them. The distance between them, once so wide, was slowly narrowing. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened, they would face it together. And for the first time since they had landed on this desolate world, he felt a flicker of hope. The days blended together on the harsh, unforgiving desert planet. The sun beat down relentlessly during the day, and the cold of the night was enough to freeze a person to their bones. Yet, for the human man and the alien girl, these extremes had become a familiar part of their existence. They had learned to adapt to the land, to each other, in a way neither had imagined possible. The man had grown accustomed to her presence. He would sometimes catch himself looking at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Her hair, so pale it almost glowed against the backdrop of the desert, her bright blue skin. An alien beauty that still took him by surprise. But there was more to her than just her looks. Over the days, the alien girl had slowly begun to share more about herself. She spoke of her past life, the world she came from, the people she had once led. It was a world far different from the one they were now stranded in, a world filled with power, politics, and battles for control. At first, the man had listened with skepticism, unsure of how much of her story was true, unsure if any of it mattered. But as time passed, he found himself believing her more and more. There was a quiet strength to her words, a conviction that told him she wasn't lying. She had been more than just a slave. She had been a leader, once. One evening, after a long day of searching for food and water, the man returned to the shelter and found her sitting by the fire. As usual, she was looking into the flames, her expression thoughtful, almost distant. He didn't say anything at first. He simply sat down beside her and watched the flickering light dance across her face. "You've been quiet today," he remarked, breaking the silence. The alien girl didn't immediately respond. She only glanced at him with her bright eyes, the hint of something unspoken passing between them. Finally, after a long pause, she spoke. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You were right before. We are not enemies anymore." The man's heart skipped a beat. For the longest time, he had felt like a stranger to her, just a man who had been forced to keep her alive out of necessity. He hadn't considered that she might see things differently. "You think so?" he asked, his voice uncertain. "Yes," she replied, her tone growing more confident. "I no longer see you as my captor. And I don't think you see me as your enemy either." He swallowed, unsure of how to respond. The words were simple, but the meaning was so much deeper. It wasn't just a matter of survival anymore. They were becoming something more to each other, something neither could easily define. For the first time, the human man felt the weight of their situation not just in the physical sense, but emotionally. He wasn't just protecting her out of duty anymore. He was beginning to care for her in ways he hadn't allowed himself to before. He had always kept his feelings at a distance, but now, in the quiet of the night, with nothing but the crackling fire between them, those feelings began to surface. "I'm glad," he said finally, his voice low but sincere. "I'm glad you don't see me that way anymore." The alien girl didn't respond, but the small shift in her posture, the way she relaxed just a little, was enough of an answer. They were slowly breaking down the walls between them, step by step, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like they were not just surviving the desert together. They were beginning to live in it. Days turned into weeks, and the two of them became a team in a way that neither of them had expected. The alien girl, once a slave, had taken to helping the human man in ways that surprised him. She had knowledge of survival tactics from her world that he never would have known, skills that made their life just a little bit easier. From finding food to protecting their small shelter from sandstorms, she was becoming an invaluable ally. But even with the growing trust between them, the chains remained. Both physical and metaphorical, they were still bound together by a past neither could escape. The alien girl's chains were a constant reminder of her past punishment, a punishment she had not yet fully accepted. And the man, despite everything, still carried the guilt of being the one who had brought her to this world. One evening, after another long day of survival, the man sat down beside the alien girl by the fire, his thoughts racing. "You know," he began, looking at the flickering flames, "I still don't understand how you ended up here. How did they take everything from you?" The alien girl looked at him, her expression hardening for a moment. She had told him bits and pieces of her story before, but never in full. This time, however, it was as though something had shifted. Maybe it was the trust that had grown between them. Maybe it was the bond they were forming. But tonight, she seemed willing to share more. They feared me," she began, her voice heavy with emotion. "I was too strong, too much of a threat, and when they sent me here, they thought they would break me." She paused, her fingers brushing the chains that still held her wrists together. "But they don't understand. The stronger the chains, the harder I fight." The man was quiet for a moment, digesting her words. He could see the strength in her now, more clearly than ever before. The chains, though they held her physically, could not contain the power that still resided in her spirit. "I don't want to be the one who keeps you in chains," he said quietly, looking at her with a newfound respect. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, there was no anger, no resentment. Just understanding. "I know," she replied softly. "And maybe, someday, you won't have to." The silence between them stretched long into the night, but it was no longer uncomfortable. It was a silence that spoke of shared understanding, of a future that, despite the harsh world around them, seemed possible. They were no longer just a human and an alien. They were two survivors, Two souls who had been broken in their own ways, and yet, somehow, had begun to heal together. The days had started to blend together, and the harshness of the desert seemed less important now. The man and the alien girl had grown accustomed to their lives in this unforgiving place. Together, they had managed to survive where others would have failed. They had become more than just two beings trying to survive. They had become a team, a pair whose bond was slowly growing beyond necessity. Though the desert was still their home, it no longer felt like a prison. The alien girl had begun to see things differently. Every day, as they worked together to gather food, find water, and protect each other from the dangers of the desert, she found herself growing more attached to the man. He had shown her more kindness than she had ever known from any of her own kind. He had saved her life more than once, not out of duty or fear, but out of a quiet sense of duty to something deeper, something more human. She had never expected to find this in him. For his part, the man was beginning to understand her in a way that he never thought possible. She wasn't just the alien girl who had been forced onto him. She was someone with her own past, her own pain, and her own strength. He had learned to admire her resilience, the way she had carried the weight of her world's expectations on her shoulders with grace. She had been punished for things she had no control over, yet she had never allowed that to define her. It was during one of their routine days in the desert when the moment of truth arrived. They had spent hours walking through the shifting dunes, their feet burning from the heat of the sand. The man had noticed that the alien girl's steps were slower than usual, and her usually bright eyes seemed distant, clouded with something that he couldn't quite identify. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft but concerned. She stopped, looking up at him for a long moment. The wind blew sand in their faces, but neither of them moved. She hesitated for a moment, the silence stretching between them like a bridge. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice almost a whisper. I think I've been thinking too much about the past, about everything I lost." He nodded, understanding. He had seen that same look in her eyes before. The weight of her past was something neither of them could ignore, but it seemed to be pulling her down now more than ever. "I know it's hard," he said, stepping closer, "but we don't have to face it alone." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they had shared in the past weeks. She had never had anyone say that to her before, not in the way he said it. It wasn't pity or a promise of rescue. It was simply a statement of fact, that in this moment, they were a team. She looked at him then, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, her defenses seemed to slip away. The walls she had built around her heart began to crumble, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but a raw vulnerability that she could no longer hide. "I'm scared," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know what happens next. I don't know what's going to happen to me." The man was silent for a moment, his eyes searching hers for any sign of doubt. "We'll figure it out together," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. "We've made it this far. Whatever happens next, we'll face it together." There was a long pause, the world around them suddenly feeling very still. The desert stretched out before them, the endless dunes and scorching sun a reminder of how far they had come and how much further they had to go. But in that moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the bond they had formed, the trust they had built, and the future that for the first time didn't seem so impossible. As they continued their trek through the desert, something shifted between them. There was an unspoken understanding, a sense that their relationship was evolving into something new. The alien girl no longer saw herself as a captive, a prisoner of fate, and the human man no longer saw her as just a duty or a burden. She was his equal, someone he could rely on, someone he wanted to protect, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The days turned into weeks, and their bond only grew stronger. They became more than just survivors in the desert. They became companions, allies in a harsh world that had no place for either of them. The man would catch her smile when they shared a moment of success, and he could feel the warmth of her trust in every glance. And the alien girl, though she had been broken once, found herself healing slowly in his presence. One evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of red and orange, the two of them sat by the fire, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the flames. The man reached over, offering her the last piece of bread from their meager supplies. She accepted it with a small smile, and for a moment, they just sat there in silence, sharing the simple comfort of the moment. "You know," the alien girl said quietly after a while, "I never thought I'd end up here. I never thought I'd be sitting next to you, eating dinner like this." The man glanced at her, his expression softening. "Life's funny that way," he said, taking a bite of his own bread. "You never really know where it's going to take you." For a brief moment, there was no past or future. There was no alien girl and human man. There was only the two of them, sitting side by side, watching the stars slowly begin to appear in the night sky. And for the first time, the man could see it, the future. It wasn't clear yet, but it was there, just beyond the horizon. And with the alien girl by his side, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The days in the desert were beginning to feel less like survival and more like a strange new life. The alien girl had learned to appreciate the quiet moments that came with their isolation. Those times when the two of them would sit side by side, watching the sunset or sharing the last of their food. Life had become simple, but it had also become a refuge, a place where the past was slowly losing its grip on her. In the company of the man, she felt a kind of peace she had never thought possible. But as the days passed, a new tension began to build in the air. The desert was vast, but it wasn't empty. The two of them had been isolated for weeks, but soon, that solitude would end. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the man turned to the girl with a serious expression. "We need to talk about what happens next," he said, his voice quieter than usual. The alien girl looked at him, a mixture of curiosity and caution in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "I've been thinking," he continued, his gaze falling to the fire. "We can't stay here forever. You can't stay here. Eventually, someone will come looking for you." The girl stiffened at the mention of others. Her entire life had been dictated by the actions of those who thought they knew what was best for her. Her punishment had been to serve as a slave to this human, a task that was meant to break her spirit. Yet, somehow, it had done the opposite. She wasn't the broken being she had been when she first arrived. She was different now, stronger. She was beginning to wonder if there was more to her life than what had been decided for her. But the thought of returning to her people, to the very society that had condemned her, was unbearable. The idea of being thrust back into a world where she was nothing more than a tool to be used was a fate she couldn't accept. "I don't want to go back," she said softly, almost to herself. "I don't know if I can face them again. I don't want to go back to being a prisoner." The man's expression softened, and he reached out, placing a hand on hers. "You won't have to go back. You don't have to face them again if you don't want to. You've earned your freedom." Her eyes widened slightly at his words. "But what about you? What about us? Where do we go from here?" He exhaled slowly, the weight of the decision weighing heavily on him. "That's the thing, isn't it? We both know this place isn't safe for either of us. It's not just about where we go. It's about how we live. We can't stay hidden forever." The alien girl looked away, her thoughts racing. What would happen if they tried to leave the desert? What would happen if they tried to live in a world that was not made for them? She was no longer the slave she had once been, but she had no idea what her future could be. She had a choice to make. The man watched her silently, giving her the time she needed to think. He didn't push her, didn't pressure her to make a decision. He simply waited, understanding that this was something only she could decide. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "What do you think is out there? If we leave, if we try to find another place, what will we find?" The man gave her a small smile. "I don't know, but I do know that we won't be alone anymore. We'll be together." The girl felt a strange warmth spread through her chest at his words. There was something comforting about the certainty in his voice. They didn't have all the answers, but they had each other. It was more than she had ever hoped for, and for the first time, she felt like maybe she could face the unknown. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been running my whole life, hiding, always afraid of what might happen next. But now I don't know what's waiting for me." The man squeezed her hand gently, his voice firm yet kind. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. Whatever comes next, we face it together." She looked into his eyes, and for the first time, she truly believed him. There was no fear in his gaze, only a quiet resolve, an understanding that whatever the future held, they would face it together. And so, they'd made their choice. It wasn't the easy path, nor was it the safe one, but it was their path. And in that moment, the desert no longer felt like a prison. It felt like the beginning of something new, something they could build together. The stars were beginning to shine in the sky above them, as the fire flickered low. They sat in silence for a few moments, letting the decision settle between them. Then, without saying another word, they stood up together. The alien girl's heart felt lighter than it had in years. For the first time, she felt a sense of purpose, a sense that the future wasn't just something that happened to her, but something she could shape. As the night air grew cooler and the fire dwindled to embers, the two of them packed their things and made plans to leave the desert. The future was uncertain, but they were no longer afraid of it. They had each other, and that was enough. The road ahead would not be easy, but they were no longer alone. And together, they would face whatever came next. The journey away from the desert wasn't easy. Every step they took into the unknown felt heavier than the last, but neither of them faltered. The girl, once a slave, now walked beside the man with a new sense of freedom that she had never imagined. Though the world outside the desert was foreign and full of uncertainty, it no longer seemed as terrifying. For the first time, she was choosing her own path. They traveled for days, crossing barren landscapes and unfamiliar terrain. The sun beat down on them during the day, and the nights were cold and still. But every time the alien girl felt doubt creep in, the man was there, reassuring her with his calm presence. His quiet strength became her anchor in this new, uncertain world. As they made their way toward a distant settlement, they spoke less of the past. The chains that had once bound her, physically and mentally, had fallen away. It wasn't just the physical chains that had kept her prisoner. It was the belief that she didn't have control over her own fate. But now, with every step they took together, she felt more like a person than a slave. One evening, as they sat by a small campfire, the man finally broke the silence. "What do you want now?" he asked, his voice soft, but filled with a quiet curiosity. The alien girl looked into the flames, her mind wandering. The question seemed simple, but it was one that she had never been allowed to ask herself before. In her old life, her desires had never mattered. She had been told what to do, when to do it, and how to live. But now, for the first time, she could decide. The possibilities felt endless. "I want." She paused, trying to find the right words. "I want to live. I want to feel free. I want to see the world beyond what I've been taught." The man smiled, nodding in understanding. "That's a good start. I'm with you. We can go anywhere. We can do anything." The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with gratitude. "I never thought I'd have that choice," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For so long, I didn't even think I deserved it." He reached out, gently touching her shoulder. "You do deserve it. We both do. You're free now, and I'll help you make the most of it." As the days passed, they drew closer to civilization. The landscape began to change. No longer were they surrounded by endless stretches of sand and rocky hills. Instead, they saw signs of human life, small villages, fields of crops, and people going about their daily routines. The alien girl couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. She had never seen such a place. The idea that she could belong in this world felt impossible. Yet, as they entered the outskirts of a bustling town, she felt a strange sense of calm. The people here were so different from the ones she had known. They weren't her captors, nor were they her fellow aliens. They were humans, and they were, in many ways, as much a mystery to her as she was to them. The man led her through the streets, his hand never far from hers. The alien girl felt the weight of stares from the townspeople. She was different. Her blue skin and alien features marked her as an outsider, but she wasn't scared anymore. Not like before. "This is the world," the man said softly, "and it's ours now." For the first time, she believed him. They found a small, humble home on the edge of the town, a place where they could live quietly and begin to build a life for themselves. The alien girl had no idea what this new life would look like, but she was no longer afraid to find out. The man was with her, and together they could face whatever challenges came their way. In the days that followed, they began to make their home their own. They built a small garden, the alien girl learning the ways of the earth as the man showed her how to plant and grow. It was hard work, but it was satisfying. For the first time in a long while, the alien girl felt a sense of accomplishment. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. And slowly, she began to understand what it meant to have a family. It wasn't just the two of them anymore. It was the life they were building, the quiet moments they shared, and the dreams they were starting to create together. It was a bond that went beyond anything she had ever known. The man wasn't just someone who had freed her. He had given her the chance to live, and in doing so, had become a part of her future. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sunset, the alien girl turned to him. "I don't know what will come next," she said softly, "but I know that I'm not afraid anymore." The man looked at her with a gentle smile. "Neither am I." For the first time, the alien girl felt like she had found a home, not just a place, but a life. And in that life, there was no punishment, no chains, and no fear. There was only the promise of what lay ahead. Together, they had found a new beginning.